Happy Constitution Day. I'm George Stephanopoulos from ABC News, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this special edition of Constitution Hall Pass, brought to you by the National Constitution Center. September 17, 2012 marks the 225th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. We want to thank you for tuning in and helping us celebrate this important milestone. This historic anniversary occurs just as our country prepares for one of the most important events established by the Constitution, a presidential election. Throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to see the Oval Office and the people who've occupied it from a lot of different points of view, and it's given me a deep and profound understanding of the United States presidency, great respect for it. In my years working for Bill Clinton, first as a campaign staffer, then as a member of his presidential administration, I got a firsthand look at everything that goes into a presidential campaign, as well as the ins and outs of running the country, how difficult a job it is. I saw just how important the role of chief executive is and how much responsibility comes with it. And I also saw how important it was to the president that the American people trusted him with that responsibility. It's pretty tough to be close to the commander-in-chief and not feel like you're part of something much, much bigger than yourself. Following my time in the White House, I entered journalism, where I got to see the presidency from an entirely different perspective. As a journalist, I've become an objective observer, responsible for making sure the American people are well informed about what our elected leaders are up to in Washington. And as you can imagine, I've gotten to know the executive branch pretty well over the years, which is why I'm so pleased to help bring you this episode of Constitution Hall Pass. Now you will know more about the presidency, too. You'll learn about its origins in Article 2 of the Constitution, which explains why the position was shaped the way it was. You'll also get up close and personal with a few of our past presidents and really see what the job is all about. Remember, the president's authority comes from the votes of we the people, so it's important that we inform ourselves about the president's role so that we know how to make our voices heard at the highest levels of power. And who knows, someday it could be you taking that oath of office. Thanks for watching Constitution Hall Pass. Have a great Constitution Day and enjoy the show.
Happy Constitution Day. I'm Mark Karras from the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. Welcome to Constitution Hall Pass. Today's a huge day in our nation's history. It's the Constitution's 225th birthday. On September 17, 1787, the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention signed their names to the document that became the supreme law of our land, the Constitution. It lays out the framework of our government and spells out our rights and responsibilities as citizens. For 225 years, the Constitution has defined what it means to be an American. Right now, our country is in the middle of a very busy election season, so we're celebrating the Constitution by examining a specific part of the government, the presidency. And how will we do that? By taking a closer look at Article 2, the section of the Constitution which outlines the presidency. To really understand the executive branch, we have to explore why our founding fathers were so concerned about executive power and how they handled those concerns. We'll learn about the father of the Constitution by visiting his house. We'll go inside the convention to find out which delegates played the biggest part in writing Article 2. We'll explore the ways that presidents throughout history have shaped the office and talk about what kinds of jobs the president does and doesn't do, as well as seeing some of the perks of the presidency. So let's celebrate Constitution Day and find out what it takes to be Commander-in-Chief. Our country is sometimes called an experiment in democracy for one very important reason. People have never been really sure what our actions will lead to. When you look at the path the presidency has taken, that really looks like an experiment. Think of it like a swinging pendulum. For a while, our leadership kept swinging between either having too much or not enough executive authority. It took us a while, and almost an uprising, to strike a balance between the two. You might say that we, as Americans, have always had issues with authority, especially when it's been lopsided and not very fair. To really understand how and why the Founding Fathers shaped the presidency the way they did in the Constitution, we've got to look back, way back, even to before we were Americans. The big problems really began after the French and Indian War. We're talking 1754 to 1763. You would have thought it was a good time to be a part of the British Empire. Britain had just defeated the French, using both colonial militia and regular British soldiers, and had been given a whole lot of new land as a result of the peace treaty. But all that fighting had cost the British a lot of money. So the British government figured that it would be fair to ask the colonists, us, to pay some more taxes, since the war had been waged to protect our homes. Here's the problem: no one really asked us. The British just told us it was happening. And of course, we, the colonists, did not think that was so fair. We even came up with an expression for it. I bet you can guess it. It has a very classic ring. No taxation without representation. We believed that we should only be taxed by people we had voted for, like the colonial assemblies. Now, taxes were being placed on us from Britain. And then, to make it even worse, they were being enforced by governors, the colony's executives, who had been handpicked by the British government with no input from the colonial assemblies. This really seemed pretty unfair. It took a revolution to solve our problem with too much authority, and when we got our turn to write our own rules, we may have pushed that pendulum a little too far in the other direction. Enter the Articles of Confederation, the first document to lay out a structure of government for the United States, which was written and ratified during the Revolutionary War. The Articles of Confederation were written with the memory of the king and the royal governors in mind, so we decided to create a weak executive branch with almost no power. All the decisions were made by the national legislature, which was called the Confederation Congress. Our individual state governments kept a lot of control over their own affairs. It seemed like a pretty good way to avoid the kinds of problems we were having before the revolution, but it swung the pendulum back the other way. Think about it. Without leadership, it can be like too many voices all yelling at once. When that happens, no one can be heard. With such a weak central government, and with no strong executive to direct its actions, the Confederation Congress couldn't stop the states from doing pretty much whatever they wanted to do. States were doing things like issuing their own money, negotiating their own trade agreements, and in some cases, even building their own navies. Our nation was in danger of falling apart. We needed the pendulum to stop swinging, and our young country to find a middle ground to survive. Welcome to Montpelier, James Madison's country estate in beautiful Virginia. President Madison is known as the father of the Constitution for all of the contributions he made to its writing and ratification, and some of his best ideas came while he was thinking right here at his home. So let's look at those ideas and see how Madison helped slow that pendulum down. The year was 1787. Our country was struggling with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. To fix things, they called a convention to be held in Philadelphia. Madison, who was on the invite list, could see firsthand how tough it was for the government to get anything done without a strong executive. As a member of the Confederation Congress, he knew this weakened the young country. So before he even left for Philadelphia, Madison did his homework here at Montpelier. He spent time brainstorming ideas for a new system of government. It was here that Madison came up with the bulk of what became known as the Virginia Plan, which would be introduced at the convention for Madison by Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph. The Virginia Plan included many of the ideas that eventually went into the convention's finished product. It included a national executive, to be chosen by the popularly elected national legislature. The executive's job would be to enforce the laws of the land and to unite the states under a single administrative voice. There were a few things that Madison wasn't sure about. For example, would the new executive be just one person or a group of individuals? But what he did know was that the young country needed a strong executive power, a person or group of people that could keep the states in line and keep the national government on track. He took his experiences with the Confederation Congress and his dedication to the ideals of unity, and he turned them into a plan for saving the young nation and protecting the freedoms which we had won just a few years before. The ideas of the Virginia Plan came together in the mind of James Madison, and it happened right here. But the process of creating a new national government would take a lot more work than just laying out a plan for the convention to accept. If we're going to talk about the debates over the executive branch, the best place to do it is back in Philadelphia at the National Constitution Center with the delegates themselves. Welcome to Signers Hall. If you could go back 225 years and stand among the Founding Fathers, this is what it would look like. Over here is James Wilson, who, despite his glasses, had a clear vision about giving the executive power to just one person. Like James Madison, Wilson had served in the Confederation Congress and had a pretty good idea of what could happen without a strong executive. On June 1st, he made his pitch for a president, one person to represent the executive authority for the entire country. Wilson thought that the United States was such a big country, it needed one strong leader to represent all those different and distant places. He pointed out that all the other elected offices were at the local or the state level, which meant that there was no one position that was voted on by all the states. But if there were a president who was chosen by all the people, then he, or maybe someday she, would be able to represent the entire country. Wilson had another idea about how to elect a president, which didn't end up in the Constitution. He wanted the president to be elected by the people directly. For Wilson, that would make the idea of the president as the symbol for all Americans even stronger. But Wilson didn't get any support for that idea. Some of the delegates had a really low opinion of everyday Americans and thought the people couldn't be trusted. Most of them were more concerned that people wouldn't be able to learn enough about the candidates to make a smart choice. So rather than have all the citizens elect the president, the delegates ended up choosing a different method. So what's that method called? Is it the presidential lottery, the electoral college, or the caucus of the states? If you said electoral college, you got it right. In the electoral college, each state gets a certain number of votes based on how many senators and representatives they have in Congress. The states choose electors to cast those votes, and whichever candidate gets the most electoral votes wins. The Electoral College was created for a couple reasons. The big one was that the founders figured the electors would be important people in each state, and they'd have the most information about the candidates. Today, the college also means that the voices of smaller states are heard in the election process. Each state gets to decide how to pick its own electors. In the old days, it was usually the state governments that would pick them. But today, the voters in each state choose the electors by voting for the person they want to be president. The state government counts up all the votes and then appoints electors who have already promised to cast their electoral vote for the winning candidate. It's a complicated system, but it goes all the way back to the founding of our country. The Philadelphia Convention also figured out a few other things. They decided on the name of president for the chief executive. They called for the president to give to the Congress information on the State of the Union. Nowadays, the president does this once a year in a nationally broadcast address. They gave the president the responsibility of appointing the heads of the executive departments. This allowed the president to form the advisory group called the cabinet. And they gave the president the power of veto over any bill passed by Congress, although Congress can overrule that veto with a 2/3 vote in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. After the Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, it was pretty obvious who the first president was going to be. George Washington was the only person in the country who was loved enough and trusted enough to be the chief executive. He won the first presidential election in 1789 by winning every single vote in the Electoral College. As president, Washington accomplished a lot of things. He restored people's faith in the national government. When he created the cabinet, he outlined the structure of what the executive branch would look like right up to today. And in his farewell address, Washington gave advice to his fellow citizens on how to make sure the country would survive. He told Americans to avoid getting caught up in the wars and rivalries of other countries, and to avoid letting political parties or factions turn us against each other. Washington's time in office set many of the precedents for the presidency. You could say that Washington made the presidency what it is today. And now that we've had a look at the creation of the presidency and the Constitution, it's time to take a look at what being the president is all about. We're headed to the nation's capital. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the most famous address in Washington. The White House is the official residence of the President of the United States. Inside the White House is the Oval Office, the personal office of the President. The White House also has 35 bathrooms, 28 fireplaces, 3 elevators, 5 full-time chefs, a tennis court, a bowling alley, and a movie theater, just to name some of the fun stuff that's in there. So what's the presidency all about? Well, it starts over there on the west steps of the Capitol, where the newly elected president takes the oath of office. From there, the Constitution spells it out. Article 2 of the Constitution lays out the job description and duties of the president. The president is elected for a 4-year term. Anyone can run for president as long as they're at least 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, and a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. The Constitution doesn't say that only men can be president, although we've never elected a woman president before. But that doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future. See, the presidency, like the United States, is always changing. Just like the United States doesn't look the same way it did in 1787, the presidency doesn't look the way it did when George Washington was in charge. Our presidents have defined the office by facing different challenges, and we can look at some of them to learn more about what the president does. Take a look at Andrew Jackson, for example. Before his election in 1828, all the presidents had been wealthy elites. Jackson was different. He came from the backwoods of Tennessee, marking the first time that a president came from the new frontier regions. He also greatly expanded the power of the executive in our government. Just look at the way he dealt with the Bank of the United States. Jackson used his time in office to redefine what the president was capable of doing, like using the power of the position and the fame it provided to get an agenda through the rest of the government. The president has also become our chief diplomat, representing our country to the rest of the world. It wasn't until 1919 that a United States president visited Europe while he was in office. It was for a good cause, too. The Paris Peace Conference, which generated the treaties which ended World War I. Any idea which president it was? If you know your history, you know the answer is Woodrow Wilson. Today, presidents visit other countries frequently in order to firm up our alliances and maintain good relationships with countries all over the world. Sometimes they go abroad to try to influence world affairs, like when Ronald Reagan visited the Berlin Wall in 1985 and told the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev,
"Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Other circumstances in our history have led to the president expanding his role in government. When Franklin D. Roosevelt was president, the country was going through the Great Depression. Roosevelt stepped up to the crisis by creating a whole new set of government agencies and programs to help people out. Social Security, the FDIC, the WPA, these and many other initiatives expanded government's role in our lives. Now, the president doesn't just get to do whatever he wants, like when Roosevelt tried to increase the number of judges on the Supreme Court to ensure that all of his policies would be found constitutional. The Senate stood up to Roosevelt and refused to confirm his nominees, showing that the president is an important part, but just a part, of the balance of powers in our government. That balance of powers comes right from our Constitution. And it's been the duty of every president since George Washington to uphold it and to protect our rights in the process. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be president yourself, and it'll be your responsibility to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Can you imagine yourself holding the highest elected office in the country? Then it'll be up to you to carry out those duties and to uphold the legacy of all those presidents who came before you. It's a tough job to get, but it's a pretty great job to have. That's it for this episode of Constitution Hall Pass. I hope you enjoyed our look at the presidency, and I wish you a great Constitution Day. From the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, I'm Mark Harris. See you next time on Constitution Hall Pass. If you want to know more about the presidency, come and visit us at the National Constitution Center. We're located in Philadelphia, just a few steps away from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. And we've got tons of stuff to keep you connected to the Constitution 365 days a year. You can also visit our friends at James Madison's Montpelier, which is located in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, or visit their website at montpelier.org. If you'd like to check out other episodes of Constitution Hall Pass, like the Story of Thanksgiving and the Bill of Rights, then just log on to constitutioncenter.org/hallpass. And in this election season, make sure your voice is heard by visiting addressamerica.constitutioncenter.org and writing your own 6-word stump speech. Your speech will then be seen by site visitors from all over the world.